This presentation is on interpersonal conflict. It is designed to supplement the reading for Andy Mangum's Speech 1311 class. And the readings are in the Think textbook, and so you need to read both the textbook and be familiar with what I say here. I'm going to try to make reference along the way as to what's in the textbook versus what I'm presenting here, but just be familiar with both and find your own way to correlate the information. Conflict is defined by William Wilmot in his book Interpersonal Conflict as the perception by one or more people that one or the other is interfering with each other's goals. That's an important description of conflict because a lot of our maybe terse exchanges with people aren't really conflicts. They're just arguments. You're sitting at a football game and you're cheering for your team and somebody's sitting 2 rows back and being very ugly and cheering for their team. You might stand up and say something to them. There might be words exchanged, but that's not really a conflict. A conflict happens when there are some preconditions. That is, these are relational qualities that have to be in place for there to be a conflict. One of those is interdependence, which is the sense that you and the other person belong to each other in a particular relational configuration. You may be spouses, you may be significant others, you may be friends, or you may be colleagues, but there is a relationship between the two of interdependence that you can name. A second precondition for conflict is goals. You go back to the definition, and the conflict occurs because you perceive that one or the other person is interfering with your pursuit of goals. That implies that you have to have them. And finally, there has to be shared resources. Shared resources are involved because that's what you're fighting about. That's how they are interfering with your goals, is that you have these resources that you want to use to achieve your goals, and they want to do something else with those resources. So what are some types of goals that we might be arguing about or having a conflict about? Well, one type of goal is simply content. There are things that we're trying to convey, and there may be conflict with the person about what it is that we mean. So the goal is simply to create shared meaning, and we have differences of opinion. Sometimes we call pseudo-conflict when people don't understand each other and they think they're arguing when they're really not. But oftentimes it goes more deeply than that in terms of different ways of thinking and what we call different epistemologies, which is how you arrive at what you believe to be true. And there may be conflicts in how you're thinking. A relational goal is just that. It's a goal that you might have for the relationship. So that if you have this interdependent relationship with someone and you love them or you think you love them and you want that relationship to be something, let's say you want that relationship to be significant, you want it to be exclusive, the other person may not want that for that relationship. And so you may have conflict over the outcome or the goal of the relationship. On the other end of the spectrum, someone may be wanting to get out of the relationship or withdraw from the relationship, and the other person wants to stay in the relationship. So there'll be different goals, conflicts over the goals of that relationship. This can also take place both in school and in work, where you think about this as an inner circle, and people want to be a part of that inner circle, whether it's decision-making within an organization or a group of friends in a social setting, and other people want to exclude them. There can be conflicts then over that relationship outcome. Identity goal has to do with how you see yourself and who you see yourself becoming. So you think back a few weeks ago when we talked about the self-discrepancy theory, that a person has an actual self, an ought self, what they think they should be doing, an ideal self, what they would really like to be. And relationships can have conflict when one person who has a significant relationship with another person has a different idea about what that person's identity should be, or what their ideal self should be, or what their ought self should be. And so there can be conflict over identity. And then finally, and the big one, of course, is outcome. You have a desire for a particular outcome at work, and another person has a different idea of what that outcome should be, or they're not being cooperative in reaching that outcome. Then you can have conflict over that goal. So those are the types of goals. So we've talked about the fact that our preconditions for conflict are interdependence. There's some identifiable relationship that matters to you and to the other person. There are goals, content, relational, identity, or outcome. And then there are shared resources. When we talk about shared resources, are things like time. So if you work with people and you have colleagues at work, your workday is a shared resource. And there may be ways in which people are using time in different ways that either contribute to achieving your goals or interfere with you achieving your goals. Say, for instance, one of my favorite questions to ask in a job interview is, what would you do if a colleague never shows up to work on time? A lot of that depends on what that colleague does. You may find it annoying, but can live with it if that person works fairly independently of you. But if your shift ends when that person's shifts begin, and they're not showing up to work on time, there might be very serious conflict. Money in both families and in organizations is a very real source of conflict when people want to do different things with the money that they share or they budget. Space has to do with just physical arrangement of shared spaces. You think about a community, and there may be conflict between citizens in a community when one group of citizens wants to use a particular space for a park and another would like it to be zoned for business. Energy and motivation has to do with people's motivation to participate with you in achieving your goals, or vice versa, your level of motivation to help them achieve their goals. Competence, just that, it's skills that a person has that enable them to achieve certain goals, and there may be differences over how competencies are used. And then materials, this physical property and how it gets used. So these are all resources, and they are all points at which conflict can occur. So when conflict occurs, I want to think about then what is the strategy we use for that. And your book talks about the Thomas Kilmann conflict modes or conflict model. And it seems like your book talks about it in some ways as a personality trait, and I tend to think of these more as contextual responses. That is, there are things that we do in certain contexts, and each of these can be appropriate in different contexts. But what we're looking at here is on the y-axis you have assertiveness or goal orientation. As you go up that y-axis, what you're looking at is an increase in the desire for a particular outcome or a particular goal. On the x-axis, that is on the horizontal axis, what you're looking at is cooperativeness or relationship orientation. As you go further to the right, then you're increasing a person's commitment to the relationship. So that gives us 5 basic responses to conflict. If a person has a fairly low goal orientation in a particular situation and a low goal to maintain a good relationship with the person, then they are likely to withdraw. And this can often be a very effective conflict response if the issue is indeed unimportant, or if you want to give people time to cool off. If we look up the y-axis to a high goal orientation but a fairly low relationship orientation, then the response is to compete. This can be an effective conflict approach if a person is out to harm you or another person. If you have to work very quickly in an emergency, you don't really want to, in emergency situations, you don't really want to have a committee meeting or to negotiate with people. You may just simply need to force that situation. In fact, some books actually refer to that as force rather than competition. It's just a very aggressive or assertive response that disregards the relationship and only pursues the goal. And that's not an ideal thing for normal situations, but it can be necessary in particular situations. Back down the y-axis, but over to the far right on the x-axis, that is high on cooperativeness and low on assertiveness, is the response of accommodation or accommodating. And again, accommodating can be an effective mode of conflict management. I would discourage anybody from using this all the time, because that's how you become, just get run over and become a road for people to walk over as opposed to a partner to walk with. But if you're trying to establish goodwill, if the issue is genuinely not important to you, but you know that agreeing with somebody would help to create that sense of goodwill, then you might accommodate them. But again, if you find that you're always accommodating, then I would suggest to you that you look at maybe some better responses. Now, if you talk to most people about what the response to conflict ought to be, most often they'll say, well, we ought to compromise. But compromise really means that everybody gives up something and everybody gets something that they want. And in those situations, what we're really talking about is, and those are most appropriate when nothing else works, when collaboration doesn't work. And so you moderate your goal orientation, and you also moderate your relationship orientation when you compromise. But in an ideal situation, if you can, the goal of good conflict management is to collaborate on a shared decision making. So that means that you really want the best outcome possible. That is, your goal orientation is high, but you also want the best for the relationship. So your relationship orientation is also very high. So how do we get to collaboration? Your book describes several models for conflict resolution. It's found on page 154. And it talks about the AEIOU model of conflict resolution and also gives you a 6-step model of conflict resolution: preparation, initiation, confrontation, consideration, resolution, and reevaluation. That seemed a little bit complex to me, and so I've sort of reduced that down to about a 4-stage model. I wish it made a nice little acronym or something, but it doesn't. The stages of conflict resolution in a collaborative sense for me are that you analyze the situation, so you agree on the key source of the conflict. What is it that you're actually arguing about or having conflict about? You explore the possible options. So what are the possible ways that we could address this particular situation? After looking at those options, you decide on a particular plan that works best for the two of you or for the people that are involved in the conflict, and then you schedule a time to reassess that. Solutions are almost always experimental, and so you have to think about when are you going to be able to come back and decide whether or not that solution has indeed been effective. So you analyze, you explore your options, you decide on the best solution, and then you come back together and assess whether that solution that's been implemented really works. A couple of other sort of disconnected things that I would like to put out there as part of conflict management, and this is where we're really starting to move into significant other relationships. That exclusive relationship you have, or a marriage relationship, or a parent-child relationship, really important key relationships. One piece of advice I have for you is to distinguish between events and issues. An event is a specific instance when an unwanted behavior is exhibited by your relationship partner. This means they may have missed an appointment or been late for a date. They may have had one aggressive outburst. They may have had a broken promise. And events, can be forgiven or not. That is, a person may have one moment of an aggressive outburst, or let's say one moment of infidelity. And you may say, nope, that's it, we're done. That one broken trust cannot be repaired. But in other situations, you may say, this is not a pattern of behavior, so we're going to forgive that. Issues, though, are patterns of unwanted behavior. So constantly being late, or constantly being verbally abusive, or constantly overspending, or refusing to compromise or communicate at all, or frequent moments where broken promises are occurring. Then you've got a conflict that you either have to work through, or again, it may be something that dissolves the relationship altogether. Issues are very difficult to outweigh, and so one of the really important questions to ask in an important, let's say, a marriage relationship, anytime you identify an issue, is this: if this doesn't change in 20 years, will you still be in the relationship? If this doesn't change in 5 years, does that mean the end of the relationship? That helps to put some perspective on, let's say, the fact that one person can't seem to get their socks into the laundry hamper, and it drives the other person absolutely nuts. One of the questions to really think about is, if that doesn't ever change, are you out of the relationship? It helps put some things in perspective. If indeed you say, you know what, this is one of those things, let's say talk about constantly overspending. If one person is constantly overspending, and you say, you know what, if this doesn't change, we really can't continue together, then you've got an issue that you have to work through, and that's where I would say you really want to collaborate. The second piece of somewhat random advice that I would give you, really not random, it has to do with communication, is to participate in the listener-speaker method. This is where you think about each of these stages of the relationships that we talked about: analysis, the options, the decisions, the assessment. In each of those stages, you should take turns letting one person be the speaker and the other person be the listener. And when the person is being the listener, listen empathically, and then allow yourself to have a voice and to speak your own mind in that situation. So we've talked a little bit about conflict. I hope you look also at the book and see what it has to say, but you'll be responsible for both this and the book content when it comes to conflict.